I'm going to introduce our panelists to you and what they're going to talk about, and then I shall be handing over to them. And as Emma says, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So feel free to put your questions into the Q&A as we go along. So in terms of our speakers, and I'm not in the time available going to do them proper justice, but we have Patrick Cannon. He's going to be talking about how does the bar perceive neurodiversity. Patrick's a former solicitor. He studied at the LSE, and Patrick, I've worked out we probably overlapped, but that's a conversation for another day. Patrick came to the dark side, was called to the bar in 2003. He's a member of the Bar Council Disability Subcommittee. He's a champion of neurodiversity in law who have liaised with the forum to put on this event. He's created Cannon Chambers at the beginning of this year, which is the first virtual barristers' chambers specialising in tax, because that is his area of practice. And indeed, Patrick literally wrote the book when it comes to taxes. He's keen to explore ways in which the new way of virtual working can accommodate the needs of trainees and juniors, especially those who think and behave differently. More of that anon. We will then hear from Faisal Sadiq, and he will be talking about how does neurodiversity fit into the framework of the bar. Faisal practices out of my chambers, Hardwicke. He focuses on property and property-related commercial disputes. He was called to the bar in 2000. He's a bencher at Inner Temple, and you'll hear a theme here. Patrick and I are Lincolns, but the rest of our speakers are all from Inner, exhibiting the wonderful cooperation that can take place between the inns, and let's have more of it. Back to Faisal. Faisal's been a bencher since 2018. He's vice chair of the Bar Council's EDSM committee. He's chair of the Bar Council's disability panel. And at Inner, he's involved in education and training committees, scholarships committee, and the EDI subcommittee. In 2019, Faisal won the Chambers and Partners Outstanding Contribution to Diversity and Inclusion. It was a long shortlist that I was on, so he beat me. So I was very happy when we recruited him to Chambers and he brought his award along with him. Then next we have Oliver May. Oliver is going to be looking at a scenario and looking at what happens when your neurodivergence as a barrister comes into play with your work and your practice. Ollie practices as a barrister out of number 5 Chambers, specialising in personal injury and clin neg. Was called to the bar by Inner in 2018. He's vice chair of neurodiversity in law, a member of the Bar Council's disability panel. He's on the BSB Race Equality Taskforce, and Ollie has what I think is one of the greatest, loveliest Twitter handles out there. It's at Oh My Days. Marvellous. So follow Ollie if you can. And then by no means least, we have Chloe coming along as our final panelist. She's going to be looking at another scenario and how her neurodivergence works for her and her clients within her practice. Chloe practices as a family barrister specialising in children work. She practices on the Northeastern Circuit out of Parklane, Plowden Chambers. Was called to the bar by Inner Temple in 2019. She's a social mobility advocate for the Bar Council, an advisor on the Executive Board of Neurodiversity in Law, and is passionate about demystifying the bar, sees open discussion about neurodiversity and disability as very much part of that exercise, and that's something I share as a passion with Chloe, so I'm delighted to have her on this panel. So just a few quick words from me as a sort of landing into this topic. The forum were very keen to look at neurodiversity, and it's something that there's been a lot more discussion about recently. So you might be surprised to know that the terminology was first coined in the late 1990s by an Australian sociologist, Judy Singer. She was autistic, and she used the term neurodiversity, neurodivergent, to include autism, ADH, various forms of dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and learning disability. But it was more about thinking of binning the concept of having normal and abnormal ways of learning and thinking, and rather talking about having different ways of learning and thinking in order to remove the stigma and actually free us up to look at how those differences could actually be used to bring value and to ensure everyone can actually perform at their best and be properly valued. That's something that really chimes with me. I, in all sorts of contexts, see a lot of strength in difference and how different teams, difference within organisations usually drives improved performance and a better experience for everyone. So for me, when I saw neurodiversity in law emerge, I was very keen to get involved as an ally, someone who's not neurodivergent, but recognising that actually the starting point was greater understanding and being brave enough to say, I don't understand this and I need to learn more in order to actually be a part of creating a more inclusive approach when everyone gets to bring what they can bring to the party, if I put it that way. We don't normally talk about the bar as a party, but why not? Anyway, enough of me. I'll just remind you again, if you have questions as we go along, do put them in the Q&A and then we can pick up on them towards the end. But I'm going to hand over now to Patrick to talk about how does the bar perceive neurodiversity.
Okay, thank you very much, Bree, and a good evening to you all. I'm delighted to be here and to have been invited to speak to you about how the bar currently perceives neurodivergent people and should the bar change its perception. Now, I'm pleased to see that we already have a question that is highly relevant to this, and it's about the problem that neurodivergent people have in interviews for trainee barrister. And I'll try and answer the question in a moment as I speak, because I do have something to say about that. Just a couple of thoughts that occurred to me, Bree, while you were talking. I was going to say, well, you kindly said that I'm a member of the Bar Council's Disability Subcommittee. And I've thought for some time now that perhaps disability is a kind of misnomer. And following on from what you were saying, perhaps we should think about renaming it to something like, I don't know, the Difference Subcommittee, to reflect the sort of points you were making. So now I know Faisal leads us in this committee, so I may well take up with Faisal offline the possibility of looking at the name of the committee. Now, the first part of the subject I've been asked to talk about concerns how the bar currently perceives neurodivergent people. And just thinking about it, my experience at a corporate level, it's pretty good. Bodies such as the Disability Subcommittee exist to foster and promote, among other things, neurodiversity. And from what I can see, they're doing a pretty good job so far as they can. The issues arise really at a more granular level, at the level of individual chambers. And the picture there is not so good as far as I can see. Individual sets vary. Some are very enlightened and accepting of neurodiversity and seek to support and foster individuals with these traits. And again, in my experience, it's when senior members of those chambers are neurodiverse, you tend to see that those who accept that they are neurodiverse, and that's not all of them, they tend to be sympathetic to trainees and juniors exhibiting neurodiversity. Of course, there is a problem with certain neurodiverse people who won't accept that they're neurodiverse, particularly rather senior people. For instance, I know a very senior barrister who exhibits a form of Tourette's. And I've experienced it myself. I've been on the receiving end. But if you were to say to that individual, I think you have Tourette's, and have you ever thought about getting it diagnosed? That particular person would be horrified. So the picture is enormously varied. So we have some sets that are quite supportive and accepting of neurodiversity. You have other sets that really need to be educated. And curiously, in my experience, those are the sets that tend to be involved in high earnings specialist areas of law, where they tend to expect behavior, particularly from new joiners and trainees, that complies with the status quo. And divergent behavior is seen, frankly, as weird and something that might scare off the types of clients that those chambers tend to attract, city firms, banks, and so on. In other words, in those types of sets, conformity tends to be the norm, and people with neurodivergent behavior are seen as odd or eccentric, and frankly need not apply. Now, coming on to the first question that we were asked about the recruitment process and the difficulties that neurodivergent people experience. The experience of neurodivergency, I think, is most apparent and acute in the recruitment process, where I have personally been shown disturbing evidence of interviews conducted with a candidate who found it difficult to maintain eye contact. And to the candidate's great credit, he made a subject access disclosure request and obtained the handwritten notes of the interviews, because something was terribly wrong. He was almost there in terms of getting an offer, but he never quite got over the line. And the handwritten interview notes revealed what he suspected. The lack of eye contact was a fundamental problem. Now, how we educate chambers and interview committees in that regard is a bit of a challenge, but it's not, but there is some hope on the horizon. But at a granular level, I'm afraid the picture is not particularly good in the more specialist high earning sets, and it does need to change. Now, can the bar change its perception? Well, I mentioned there is some hope, and that hope, something I've experienced over the past year, it's the development of technology, and quite frankly, Zoom. The advent of video meetings, court hearings, remote working potentially creates a great leap forward for those of us who are neurodiverse. And I'll give you a very simple, straightforward example of that happened to me 2 weeks ago. I was conducting a mediation, and it was my first mediation by Zoom. And I've done in-person mediations before. But this mediation was particularly awkward because the two sides personally loathed each other. It was to do with some rather complex VAT and customs duty issues, where the two sides had fallen out. And they each brought along 3 or 4 technical VAT and customs duty experts, as well as barristers and solicitors. There were actually 14 people in the mediation. And given the personal dislike of the principals, it was always going to be a very difficult mediation to manage. And an in-person mediation of that nature would have been particularly challenging. And personally, if you put me in a room with a lot of people who are at war, I get intensely uncomfortable and I simply don't like it. Zoom was a breath of fresh air. And to be quite straightforward, I began the mediation having muted everybody. We had a plenary session and I allowed one person to speak at any one time for 10 minutes. And then I put everybody into breakout rooms and I visited each room in turn. It went on for 8 hours. We never got back to a plenary session because of the differences, and the mediation failed. But from a technical perspective, it went like a dream. People were not able to talk over each other because I wouldn't let them. And there were no personally difficult situations because everyone was in breakout rooms. It was a very civilized way to conduct a mediation, particularly difficult mediation. So that is a concrete example, I think, of how technology can help neurodiverse people to manage in situations like that, because there's a lot more control and there's a lot less direct in-person eye contact, for example. So I'm very hopeful of the future as the new way of working becomes more common, with people working much more remotely. I think the effect is that neurodiversity and the sort of traits that neurodiverse people exhibit will become less noticeable. And the unique skills that neurodiverse people bring will come more to the fore, and the sort of weird traits that neurotypical people tend to see will become more diluted on a technical basis when business is conducted remotely. And so the perceived negatives of our different behaviors will be diluted and will be less important. So I'm very confident that the technological advances of the past year or so will prove of benefit to us as we go forward. Now, the challenge, just before I finish, the challenge of remote working, of course, is always going to be with trainees and juniors and how you bring them into the life of Chambers and the work that you do. I know a lot of people have concerns about that. I'm personally very confident about that because I don't see anything wrong with, for example, a mandatory meeting twice or maybe 3 times a day with the trainee or junior. Obviously, you get them involved in any remote video hearing or conference, but regular Zoom meetings with the trainee or the junior to get feedback and to follow up on work that's being handed out, I think could actually be an improvement on in-person chambers, where those things often tend to get overlooked in the rush to get things done. With Zoom meetings, however, one schedules and one sends out the invite, and it's much more difficult for the senior person involved to ignore them and say, oh, I'm too busy to do that. So personally, I'm very hopeful, and I think that the technology will assist in the bar generally changing its perception of neurodiversity. So that's all I've got to say. Back to you, Bree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. If I can now hand over to Faisal, who's going to talk about how does neurodiversity fit into the framework of the bar.
Thanks, Bree. I think where I will start is, and forgive me for if there are other questions, I'm not very good at using Zoom. So I can see at 6:15, someone's queried the point that given that chambers don't employ barristers, they don't have the same legal duties to make reasonable adjustments as an employer might. And that we have a whole question there that actually, I think I promise I didn't plant the question. It helps me frame my segment, as it were. So let me just talk you through a little bit of law. And then I will deal with some of the ways a bar counsel can help, and I have a few thoughts on some of what Patrick has said. So, first of all, Section 47 of the Equality Act prevents barristers, chambers from discriminating against pupils, tenants, both in the offering of pupillage or prospective pupils, both in the way we might offer prospective pupillage tenancy and in terms of what happens once you get your foot through the door. It's also worth bearing in mind that the definition of discrimination in the Equality Act, Section 15 makes direct discrimination against people with disabilities unlawful, and Section 21 makes a failure. Section 20 imposes an obligation on, amongst others, chambers to make reasonable adjustments, and Section 21 makes it unlawful discrimination for a chambers to fail to give reasonable adjustments. The Code of Conduct in Part 2 of the BSB Handbook effectively gives additional teeth to the Equality Act, in that breaches the Code of Conduct expects members of the bar to comply with the Equality Act. Breach of your obligations under the Equality Act will simultaneously trigger a breach of your obligations under the Code of Conduct. Why does that matter? So, one of the fun aspects of my role as chair of the disability panel is I get a lot of queries throughout the year from chambers that want to know, how do we deal with, we've got a tenant or an applicant for pupillage or a pupil who has raised that they have X or Y issue. Relatively recently had a query in terms of a tenant who had ADHD. And what I find very heartening, bear in mind we're professional lawyers, we all know, not only do I think that by and large people want to do the right thing, but we also understand that there are sanctions if you do not do the right thing. The questions I by and large get are, how do we comply with our duties? What support do we give? So, in terms of, I've set out the statutory and regulatory framework. In terms of how neurodiversity fits in the context of the bar, the person who raised the question was right. I'm self-employed. All of us practicing from chambers are self-employed. But that doesn't get rid of the fact that not only are chambers under an obligation to provide support, but I get, in a course of the year, I was discussing this with some colleagues on the disability panel recently. I think I get upwards of 50 requests for support and advice from chambers a year in terms of how do we support this member of chambers. These aren't from chambers that are they're not always from chambers that are particularly well heeled. I've tended to find there is an enormous desire to do the right thing. What I have found, and I think the one takeaway I would invite you to at least think about in terms of what I'm saying, is where I think problems arise in terms of the framework of the bar is. If you think of a barrister's chambers, we don't have a conventional barrister's chambers, doesn't have an HR department. So many years ago, I was a civil servant. If you were neurodivergent, there'd be people in the HR department at Treasury solicitors who would be able to give support and advice to people in leadership positions on what they should do to comply with their obligations. And also there'd be people who I had training on, people may not want to disclose that they are neurodivergent, but here are things you should think about if you're managing people. These are the things you might want to do. We don't get that training. If you've not been lucky in the way I have and had a stint at the employed bar, you may not have, barristers and chambers may not have had the sorts of training I've had, and they may not really understand quite what's expected of them in terms of reasonable adjustments. In my experience, problems tend to arise, and I have an example suitably anonymized and with the permission of the person I helped to give it this evening. I was asked to intervene to give some help to a young man who has ADHD, who's in chambers, and his ADHD, because he hadn't been understandably open with chambers and saying, here is, I am neurodivergent, I have ADHD, I need support from you in the following ways. Chambers was really struggling to support him, and there was a real question mark as to whether what behavior that was effectively symptomatic of his ADHD was being attributed to perhaps a desire not to commit full time to practice at the bar, or perhaps not really wanting to give it your all. Once he had the dialogue with his clerks and his EDO, and I can tell you, I'm not convinced that his clerks and his EDO were necessarily the most progressive people you will ever meet, but nevertheless, their position was, once they understood what the issue was, a need for support, that there was a regulatory obligation, a legal obligation, they were keen to do what they needed to do to comply with the law. One, I think, in terms of the framework of neurodivergence at the bar, I think it is probably better, one, to be quite upfront about it, but also I think it's important to understand, I mean, one of the great things about our disability panel is I often get thrown questions where I do not necessarily understand how someone can be supported who needs a reasonable adjustment, what reasonable adjustments might be necessary. Organizations like Neurodiversity in Law, Bar Council, if you need support or help, pick up the phone, drop them an email. That should, one would hope, give you some measure of support. Taking a step back from the regulatory and reasonable adjustments, I think it's, as the questioner put it, we're all self-employed. So in a sense, being neurodivergent, as long as you've got adequate support from your clerks, I'm self-employed, you know, your career, your practice is what you make of it. And so I think, but ensuring you get that support from your clerks, support from chambers is quite important. And I think that Patrick is right, technology has an increasing role to play in that. I've seen people, when I started in 2002, really struggled with things like dyslexia, for whom technology has been, you know, completely revolutionized their practice. What I would say, in terms of Patrick's rather bleak assessment, having worked in this field for the last 10 years or so, there is still work to be done, but I cannot tell you how different the landscape is today as against 10 years ago. Genuinely, I would say 10 years ago, when we were having these sorts of discussions, you would often have people saying there is no real, quietly behind closed doors, people who you know, Chatham House rules. Is there really a place at the bar for people who are neurodivergent? Really, shouldn't they be shuffling off to do something else? I have to say, in my experience, there has been a sea change in the profession over the last 10 years. Marrying up with our one bar ethos, the appreciation that diversity brings its own rewards, understanding that people who have different experiences will approach things in different ways, and often not only can that make a chambers more successful, but even in terms of a team working on a case together. I know at least of one silk who goes out of his way to ensuring that he does a lot of commercial work, ensuring that people who are neurodivergent get an opportunity to work with him. One, because he finds that they will often approach things in a different way. The way they work may mean often they will uncover things that he hasn't thought of. And I've been very heartened over the last 10 years. I think that there is still work to be done, but I think we've a lot of progress has been made. So if you're thinking of coming to profession, please don't be put off. If you're thinking of coming or in the profession and are struggling, Bar Counsel is there to help, although I'm afraid if you call, there is every risk you will end up speaking to me, which is not something I'd necessarily wish on my worst enemy, but there we go, beggars can't be choosers. Organisations like Neurodiversity in Law are there to help, but I do think there is a general desire in the profession now to be more inclusive, not just because of the law, but because it is understood, as I know Oliver and Chloe will come on to shortly, it's understood that neurodivergence actually can enrich the profession. Thank you, Brie.
Thank you, Faisal. And for my part, I'm always very happy to find you're the person I'm talking to. If we can then move on to Ollie, I think, as Faisal says, you're going to be talking about how being neurodivergent helps with tasks that we all have to do, and you're doing that particularly with regard to advising on quantum.
Yes, thanks very much. And as you mentioned kindly at the start, my Twitter handle, perhaps more importantly, the Twitter handle of Neurodiversity in Law is at ndin_law. So if you're intrigued by today or want to get any more insight into what we do, please do follow on Twitter. Yes, so I'll be talking about how my neurodivergence impacts my approach to work. And I've deliberately chosen, as of course Chloe has as well, a task that I do on an almost daily basis, sometimes more than the daily basis at the moment, it's quite busy. And specifically talking about advising on quantum, and within that, dealing with schedules of loss. Now, many of you will be more than familiar with that already, so I won't go into detail about what that entails. But the context of that is that I am dyslexic. Now, the central features to advising on quantum in the context of personal injury and clinical negligence, and of course in other areas as well, are numeracy, distinguishing and drawing parallels with comparator cases, and of course consideration of counterfactual scenarios. So in particular where a case concerns, for example, someone who will be unable to work in the future or will have their working life affected, and or will require some care ongoing. And so I'm going to do a warts and all of the effects that my particular brain has on my approach to those tasks. And I'm going to do both pros and cons. So if anyone who instructs me is watching, please do bear with me, and I'm happy to talk about it afterwards if it's of a concern to you. In terms of the pros and cons as well, I've split them into two sections. The first is the analysis of the issues itself, and the second is the delivery of the advice. So in terms of the pros, I have what I would describe as a very visual method to working. And it's something that's quite hard to describe, but when I say that, it doesn't necessarily need to be a visual matter itself. So even when the task is something quite abstract, my planning, my thinking about something is almost on a literal 2D map picture image in my mind. I can see what pieces need to come together, and when I say see what pieces need to come together, I often mean quite literally. I can sort of picture it visually. Now that makes it it's very advantageous for me when I'm thinking about how to approach a task and which bits feed into which other parts. And it's also very useful for when something is missing from a task, because I can quite literally spot it. I can see where there is a gap in what I'm doing, and I know I need to fill that gap. So I don't very often ever lose track of the minor elements of a task, because it would be like seeing a hole in a curtain or something. It's quite an obvious, striking image to me. So then there's thinking about comparable problems and comparators. Well, the dyslexic brain is very good at finding connections between different things, at drawing comparisons between seemingly unrelated topics. Now that's really useful inevitably for analysing comparators, and also very useful for thinking about counterfactuals. So when I'm thinking about a counterfactual, I might be thinking about, well, what would someone be doing 5 years from now if they were working, had they not had some accident? And conceptualizing that and thinking about how their life specifically might be affected by what's happened to them, and planning, almost drawing out that hypothetical alternative reality, is something that I find conceptually very simple, and my brain, I think, certainly helps me with that. But it's also useful for things like analysis by analogy. So where perhaps a case reminds me of another case, or even something completely outside of the law, sometimes thinking about a problem in the light of some other issue that I've considered or faced, or even just read about in the news or in a book perhaps, can be a very useful way to help me think about how things piece together and how they link. But that is linked to a con, which I'll come on to in a moment. And then the third one I've got regarding the pros for the analysis is that I am highly numerate. Now, I should caveat this by saying I have no idea if my numeracy is related to my dyslexia. I think there's probably some causal link, but it's not necessarily that the dyslexic brain is good at numbers. I don't know, I'm no expert on that point. But I am a late diagnosis dyslexic, for context. I was diagnosed in my mid-20s, I think 24 years old, which means I went through all of my education up until doing the GDL and bar course, completely unaware that I was on, should we say, not a level playing field. And that meant that I felt inherently pushed towards more numerate subjects like maths and the sciences, because those were the things I did best at, and those were the things I struggled at least. So I ended up doing mostly numbers related A levels and an economics degree, my undergraduate degree. And meaning no disrespect to anyone who finds these things difficult, I find the maths involved in personal injury schedules incredibly easy. And it's certainly an advantage I think I have, the speed with which I can do those problems. Now, considering the cons of analysing those issues, there is the inevitable one, the predictable one. It does take me longer to go through written material. When I first glance at a page, I pretty much see all the words almost at once and in no particular order. Now, that can be useful for trying to think outside the box and think how something might be slightly different. So if I inadvertently read a sentence in the wrong order, I will get a different feel for it. That, of course, is the wrong feel for what it's trying to convey, but it does mean that it naturally flows into considering alternatives or what might have been there instead. But of course, the negative with that is that I can misread material if I rush over it too quickly. And the mitigant to that is to just do it very carefully and very methodically. And I'm well practiced at doing that, to the point where I didn't even realize I was doing it until I was in my mid-20s. And then the point linked to earlier on about analysis by analogy, a challenge that I think I face because of the way my brain works is making sure that the comparators and the analogies I draw, well, 2 points. One, are actually relevant to a material issue that's going on. So the best way to describe it, I think, is that these analogies, these comparisons, they aren't things I search for. They aren't things I ponder on for a moment. They just leap into my mind entirely of their own accord, and they will just jump in front of me, as it were, without me doing really anything. Now, that's great if I'm trying to think of things, but if I'm not, and I'm just trying to work through a problem, if I'm reading through something that's not a material issue, for example, in a case, and an interesting comparison jumps in my mind, I need to not get distracted by it and turn away from it and not get drawn into it. And the second point is that the comparisons can seem very obvious to my mind, and there are always these comparisons to be drawn, I think, between even the most different and abstract ideas. But the effort it can take to make a comparison relevant to a case, explain it in a way that's followable by someone to whom it's not immediately obvious, sometimes the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So it might be that there is an analysis or an analogy that I use that's simply too convoluted, and while it might help my thinking of a problem, it's not a useful thing to include in a piece of written advice, because it's just this strange aside that might please some people but mostly would just distract. So drawing my brain away from those weird comparisons is an important factor I have to mitigate regularly. And then in terms of delivery of the advice, again, I've split it into pros and cons, but there's only really 1 point for each. And the pro in terms of delivery of advice, of course, some of it is oral, but most of it is in writing. And a skill that's very closely linked to dyslexia is empathy. And I don't mean just empathy in the sense of understanding someone's emotional reaction to something or someone's feeling in that way. Specifically, and what is very useful, is it is entirely second nature for me to consider someone else's reading of something I've written. So just reading something as though it's from scratch and as though I didn't write it, as though I don't have my numerous economics background or my legal training, but reading it afresh, as it were, without any of that existing knowledge, empathizing with perhaps the lay client, because a lot of my analysis goes to lay clients, maybe the parents of someone whose child has suffered an injury, who wants to understand the value of the claim that they're the litigation friend for their child for. They are almost certainly going to be reading those pieces of advice. And I find it second nature to make sure that the way I write is digestible from someone who doesn't have a legal understanding and a legal knowledge, because that, I think, is an important aspect of what I do specifically. And the fact that I can do that, and it not only is it second nature, but I find it easy to do, is something that it is very closely related to my neurodivergence. But then the con, and almost the flip side to that, is again the inevitable problem with rereading text. So the issue with reading a document when trying to flick through it quickly, reading text in the wrong order, reading paragraphs out of sync for context. Letters don't jumble around for me, but entire words often do. That problem is double, treble, quadruple in terms of how effective it is and how bad it is when it's something that I myself have written, because I glance through a sentence, seeing the sentence as a whole all at once. So where I've reworded it a few times, or I've fiddled around with the way I've written it, I will quite often, if I'm not careful, miss strange grammatical errors from where I've put the subject at the start of the sentence, having initially had it at the end of the sentence, and so on. So again, that's a con, that's a real negative that the way my brain functions causes to the work I do, but I'm well familiar with how to mitigate it, and I do try and keep on top of those things. Anyway, thank you. That's all I had to say on that.
Oliver, I think it's really interesting your reference to being able, from an empathetic point of view, to revisit what you've written as if you hadn't written it and as if you weren't you. Because I was wondering whether, and particularly given what you said about your late diagnosis, whether functioning and thinking in contexts that were not designed for you and were not ready to work in your way, to what extent you think that gives you an enhanced self-awareness and an awareness of others?
I find it so difficult to determine where the bounds are between what is some other aspect of my personality and what's linked to my neurodiversity, because throughout my formative years, it just wasn't something I was aware of. So it's all just me, to me, if that makes sense. But I think there must be some link to the fact that dyslexic people are so empathetic, that I do constantly reflect on the advice I'm giving or what I'm saying. It's useful in court as well, trying to frame something from the perspective of not be with me on a
presentation relating to case preparation and client handling, and what your neurodivergence brings to that.
Thanks, Bree. So I'll be speaking about that topic from my experience as a 20-something-year-old working class woman with dyspraxia and as someone on the autistic spectrum, but also as someone who cares for family members with other disabilities. I state all of those factors. I'm a big believer in the importance of intersectionality, and that my experiences from all of those factors will be different to others, even with my same conditions. I was also diagnosed at 15 as being on the autistic spectrum, and around 13 or so with dyspraxia. And again, that late diagnosis point can also be relevant as to how I've developed coping strategies throughout my life. So case preparation, particularly regarding client handling. So that's an important part of my work as a family practitioner. There's a big focus on interacting with clients, and that's something that someone who's autistic might worry about, but it's something I really enjoy about my area of law. And a common scenario that I would encounter, if not daily, then at least a few times a week, is representing a parent, often at an important hearing, such as a final hearing, where they disagree with the local authority evidence and the final care plan for their child. And those parents often have some sort of vulnerability themselves, whether that be a suspected or diagnosed mild learning difficulty or disability, drug or alcohol misuse, and often mental health problems. And a great deal of empathy and sensitivity is required when dealing with those clients. And again, that's something that if you have neurodiverse condition might cause you stress in some way. We've also got the fact that currently you often won't meet your client in person until a final hearing, if you meet them at all, because of COVID, and you have to battle technology. And again, if you're neurodiverse, technology can either be something that's great for you or something that is negative for you. Trying to build rapport with a client over a telephone when you've never met them can be quite tricky. And I think that the way I handle my conditions means that I can use that as a strength. And lastly, before I go into more strengths and weaknesses, it's important to think about different clients when you're having conferences. A client with a solicitor will be very different to a conference with a client who is a parent or a grandparent or anyone else. And how you approach conferences is key. And it all comes down to preparation. And that's something that I will be saying is something I think I do quite well, and something I think a lot of neurodiverse people do instinctively, and that can be a real positive for a career at the bar. But first, if we can think of some potential negatives that you might think of when you think of a neurodiverse practitioner in one of these scenarios. The negatives I'm going to state are both a mixture of general assumptions that I think people make, but also a mixture of my lived experiences as well. So a negative is that people might think you have difficulties time managing or controlling a client with limited time, because you might struggle with time management. That's quite a common trait if you're dyspraxic. And a common myth about autistic people is that you have no empathy. In reality, I find that you're in fact overly empathetic, and you need to be able to manage that. You might have a difficulty as a consequence establishing rapport. You might not be very good at eye contact, or you might not see the importance of small talk in building rapport. You might think that it's a waste of time. Another negative is that for some reason, autistic people quite often use overly complex language because it seems typical to you. My parents often tease me about this even now. I might refer to someone as being particularly loquacious, and mum will turn to me and say, "You could have just said talkative." So that's another negative that people might think of. And then seeing patterns and details where the bigger picture might have been more important. And you might get distracted easily if you're sat for long periods of time without something to do with your hands. And then a negative I really find is the opposite of Ollie. I really struggle to process numbers, and I really struggle to process visual images. There's a reason I'm not a civil practitioner. Part of that is because I love family law, but another part is I couldn't cope with all the quantum that you might get in a stage 3, or with trying to recreate a road traffic collision or any scenario like that. I simply can't visualize those processes in my head. But if we think of those negatives, when you carefully consider them, what you will find instead is that they're either positives or can become positives through care and planning and careful preparation and decision making, such as avoiding a certain area of law if you know it's full of your pitfalls. So again, I'm a family children lawyer, not a matrimonial finance family lawyer. So some positives that I think really emerge, at least for me, but I think for other neurodiverse practitioners, are that you're big on preparation. If anything, you might feel underconfident because of these assumptions that's made about you. And if you're anything like me, you will turn that into a positive by being very well prepared. I'm methodical, I prepare for the unexpected. I like to be prepared because it makes me more confident, and that in turn makes the client more confident. And I like to have the facts of the papers at my fingertips. It's something the judge will often mention. I'm always the first advocate to give you a page reference when you ask for one. And that's because I know the importance of preparation, and I try and compensate for what I might perceive as my deficiencies by being well prepared. Again, I'm conscientious and diligent. I want the best for my client. Again, that comes to being empathetic. If anything, I can be too empathetic, although I've gotten quite good now at controlling that and using it as a motivation to get the best of the client rather than being bogged down in the sordid details. I will always set time aside for conferences, and I will plan my diary well in advance to make sure that I do have time. Again, time management is often seen as a negative of someone who's dyspraxic. So I have whiteboards and charts and diaries everywhere to make sure I stay on track. I also set alarms because of the bad habit of forgetting to drink all day. So I try and have a water bottle with me and set alarms to remind me to drink. Again, that's something that you might find you do, and there are great maps, idea mappers and other devices out there to remind you to do that. I'm able to break down complex information and convey it in a language adapted to a client, because I'm quite conscious that I use language in a certain way. I really spend time making sure that I use appropriate language for a client. However, they find something funny I've been told. Apparently I sound like a barrister. That's what my clients tell me. I think it's a mixture of the fact that whilst I still sound northern, and so they like that, I don't sound overly northern, and so they think I sound like a barrister. It's something I've been told quite a lot. I'm interested to know other people's experiences with that, but apparently people who are autistic are often quite well spoken if they're regarded as, to use a term I don't really like, highly functioning. Not sure why that is, but it seems to be a common trait. And then again, I think I have quite a good memory for detail and can pick up on issues in statements and draw clients in to focus on those despite limited time available to parents. And a combination of all of these things means I feel I'm able to really build that rapport with clients at one of the worst times of their life. I'm yet to meet a parent who has ever told me that they would rather lose their children than go to prison. It's funny, crime and family are those areas, I think, where you're facing two of the greatest losses in your life, either the loss of your own liberty and the loss of your children. And a recent survey on Twitter showed that most people would say they would rather go to prison themselves than lose permanent custody of their children. And I think that if you have neurodiverse conditions, you can be a great advocate for someone in a real time of struggle and turmoil if you recognize the strengths and weaknesses of yourself from those conditions and learn to turn those weaknesses into actual positives. So I hope that some of those things will emerge in our Q&A discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chloe. That was really interesting and another perspective, and doing some myth busting as well, I hope, for people. There have been lots of questions coming in. Some have been answered by panelists as we've gone along. I've picked up on a few of them. One talking about resources to actually make adjustments and ensure that processes are inclusive for neurodivergent people. I'm talking about Zoom, which there's been references to from the panel and in chat. Some people it's helpful, some not. But a suggestion with interviewing and Zoom, and that by stripping out quite a proportion of the non-verbal clues and what's going on, actually for interviewers causes more focus on content and helps with trying to strip out some of those, what I would call unconscious biases. I don't know if anyone else on the panel's been doing either as an interviewer or an interviewee and has any views on that as to whether it's working better or worse from that point of view on Zoom.
I'm happy to go if that's all right. So I think it really, I mean, the worst answer I could give for all the questions is it depends, but it often does, unfortunately. And I think the thing with Zoom rather than in person is if you're someone who, so Patrick touched on this early on, if you're someone who finds it difficult to maintain eye contact, well, no one knows that if you're doing it by Zoom. So that's a good advantage there. I think when someone may feel that their social cues are divergent from the norm, no one's used to Zoom. There's no way that stands out right now, the way things are going on. But in terms of some people find it much easier, and this has been touched on in the comments, I think, in the chat box. Some people find that a lot of the way they communicate, and this is for me personally, is benefited by sort of feeling the room a bit and understanding, well, quite literally how people are feeling and how people are sort of micro changes in people's mood or where they're sitting or what they're thinking can be detected to an extent. And the inability to do that because it's over Zoom and you can't necessarily see what people are doing can hamper that and maybe put some people more on edge.
Thanks, Ollie. Faisal, you took your mute off, so I'm thinking
Yes.
You're ready to have a go.
I was, yes. I would agree with what Ollie said. I do a lot of interviewing for both I took part in one round of pupillage interviews for Hardwicke this year. I suppose I had and I probably see about 60 to 80 people I interview through in a year. It is, I think there are pros and cons, which is where I come back to Ollie's it depends. One issue is I've noticed when I've had, because I often chair a panel, if someone's raised for interviews at INA, if someone's raised the fact that they are neurodivergent and they flagged up they want a reasonable adjustment, I will often be told. And so I will then, on the basis they need the reasonable adjustment. So when they're in person, often it is easier for me, and possibly I'm not very good at it, I don't know, but I find it's easier for me to read issues with the candidate. I've got more of the body I can see. And so there may be little clues that, you know, completely still neck up, but little clues that I can see there's a problem here, there are issues. I've also noticed, I'd agree entirely with Ollie. I think that the fact that panelists here, everyone looks tiny. When we're interviewing for scholarships this year, I only had one person I needed to look at, the student. The student was having to look at 4 of us. So I have a giant 27-inch monitor where I can see the student. Probably I will see them from neck up much more clearly than I would ever see in real life. They do not know how closely I'm able to see their body language. But little cues like perhaps they're going on a little too much, or maybe they're not picking up, able to read the room. Difficult in real life, much more difficult on Zoom, really difficult when you're speaking to an audience of 4, when you possibly, you know, we had one student who afterwards gave me feedback, who said, because they're neurodivergent, they said that they found it quite difficult to effectively read the room because they were doing the interview on their MacBook Air 13-inch screen with 4 little windows. It was very, very difficult. So I think it really does, your mileage does vary. I'm not convinced that Zoom is a universal panacea. I think it can help some people, not necessarily all. I think what one needs to do is have a very careful think about what sort of adjustments you need, what if any issues you might have in the context of an interview, and then think very carefully about how the technology may help or hinder.
So do we think that actually what we should be doing in, you know, pupillage interviews and at other stages is offering people the option, now that we're familiar with working in both ways as members of the bar, whether working for the inns or in chambers, that actually we know we can do it either way, and offering people the option depending which they find the most effective mechanism?
Funnily enough, we're having precisely that discussion at Inner. I think that there is a lot to be said for giving people the option. I mean, one thing it's worth bearing in mind is, certainly in the context of Inner, I think all 4 inns are going to have this. All of the stuff I do in terms of interviewing, the 80 people I see a year, I don't get paid for that, and there's an opportunity cost in terms of my having to be unavailable for work to do the interviews. And so the impact of that is, I suspect that part of the impetus for doing these interviews electronically in the future is the inn doesn't need to have the physical sort of real estate in which you can accommodate everyone. We're not paying for people to have lunch, which was really the only reason I did that for many years. And then on top of that, it's easier to ask people to give up time. So I think my preference would be to have some flexibility. Whether and to what extent we could offer everyone the option of either having in-person or digital interviews, I don't know. That's still a discussion we're having.
I think, Ollie, you wanted to come in on something.
Yes, thanks. I think there are a few reasons why it would be good to offer virtual interviews. I mean, nothing is more accessible perhaps than your own living room. So even in a physical accessibility point is an important point as well. There's also the financial effect of having to travel in to the inn that is a major barrier for some people. And again, as you've said, some people may find that if they're neurodivergent, that they perform their best or they're most comfortable if they can do something over Zoom. So I think there's a number of advantages to both the inns or chambers, if it's a chambers interview, as well as the applicants.
Thank you, Ollie.
I think what emerges. Oh, sorry, I was just going to
Go
say.
on,
I think what emerges there is that a degree of choice and cooperation is essential, regardless of whether a candidate is neurodiverse or not. I think as we enter this sort of new normal, where we recognise both the merits and disadvantages of remote working, letting candidates know that they won't be penalised one way or another, whether they elect to have a remote hearing or a remote interview or an in-person interview, is key, because people do better in different scenarios. They may have childcare commitments as well that mean it would be better for them to do something remotely.
Or geography may mean it's
geography.
better.
Yeah, good example. I do a lot within a temple. I've done even more this past year or so because I'm able to attend from York without having to get the train down to London for a couple of hours on a panel. So I think we're really learning that we can be much more joined up in our way of thinking, and that it's so important to have that dialogue with candidates and ensuring that they are able to perform at their best, and that we do our best to support them with that.
I'm going to shift subjects, and it may be, Patrick, that you've already answered this because you've been an absolute star answering questions in writing in the Q&A. But I saw there was a question about solicitors expecting to be wined and dined, and that being loud places that may be acutely uncomfortable for some neurodivergent barristers, how to wrestle with that. And I thought, as a solicitor, you're a good one to ask to answer that one.
Well, I've
Former
just,
solicitor.
Thank you, Brie. I've just attempted an answer to that. And I began by saying I feel your pain. Those of us who have difficulty with noisy, crowded rooms, my idea of hell. Earlier on in my career, when I had to do these things and I didn't have a choice, I tended to just grin and bear it and do an hour or so, and then find something urgent that I had to do and leave. So really, if I went into those sort of environments saying to myself, it's only for an hour, you'll be out after about an hour, that got me in there. And do you know, sometimes if you had perhaps a few too many glasses to drink, you'd end up staying 2 hours or even longer. But I'm not suggesting at all that you medicate using alcohol. But that's the way I would do it. I would just give myself a limited time window and do what you have to do, and then and then get out. I think it'd be more effective. Could I just raise, Brie, something slightly different? I noticed in the chat and in one or two of the questions, a point about female lawyers and how
I was going to come to that next.
They seem to be less common than male spectrum autistic lawyers. And there's a female trust and tax lawyer who was making the point about, I think by implication, it's more difficult for females. Well, of course, it's very well known, and I have at least 2 of my daughters are on the spectrum. It's very well known that females find it far more difficult because of the nature of society to come out about their autism, and they learn to mask it much more successfully than men. So I'm not sure I agree that there are fewer autistic women than men. I think women are just better at masking it. And that certainly the evidence is that way. So I'm not sure what we do about it, but I think accepting the fact that there are, probably an equal proportion of autistic female lawyers as men would be a starting point. Yeah,
I think, Patrick, as I understood the comments, there's a lengthy one in chat. I think it's at about 6:19, which was talking about the sort of expectation around women's behaviour and much less tolerance of behaviours that might occur with neurodivergent people from women than from men. And then either the result may be, as you suggest, Patrick, that women hide it better, or they hide themselves more and don't engage. Chloe, I wondered, as the female on the panel who's neurodivergent, if you wanted to say anything about that.
Sure. So I'm an autistic female at the bar, and I think the fact that I was diagnosed at 15 only because of repeated perseverance in getting that diagnosis is also an important point. Women learn to mask from a young age because that is expected of us. The way we are socialized and expected to fit in with the mold means that we learn how to hide our autism, often at the impact of impacting our mental health and our sense of person, because we want to fit in. And we are told that as women, we must fit in and we must do this and that. And I think that a lot of the time it's because women aren't diagnosed in the same way as men. Partly, I think that's because the criteria for diagnosis are too masculine based. So women are almost by design not included in the assessment, or will score points differently on the autistic assessments, because it will say, oh, she empathized because she said thank you when I opened the door for her. And it's because we're told to do that rather than it being a natural experience. We learn to mimic very well, to the point where you almost don't realize you're mimicking anymore and you just do it automatically. So it's a very bizarre experience. I also think that women choose certain areas of law and are overrepresented perhaps in certain areas of law more than others. Family law seems to be an area predominantly female, although I do note that we of course aren't as represented at QC level and perhaps judicial level, especially in the higher courts. And currently I don't think there are any senior family lawyers in the Supreme Court. There may be one who's about to leave, I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're very much seen as family-based people, both in life and in law. And that doesn't seem to translate to us being in higher positions. And I do wonder whether part of our attempt at improving that is to hide everything that's different about us by not explaining that we're neurodiverse, perhaps also not explaining your LGBT, or trying to hide your childcare commitments and not want to kick up a fuss when the court says we'll sit till 6 tonight because you don't want to be penalised for it. So I think, again, thinking with my intersectionality hat on, I think all of those factors are at play there when it comes to why we don't see so many autistic lawyers visually at the bar. Although from experience, I know that we are out there.
That resonates very strongly with me, Chloe, from an LGBT point of view, where people often say to me, but Brie, where are all the lesbians? And you're sort of conscious that as a female at the bar, there's no hiding that. That's there, and the assumptions are made, the way you're treated, etc., flows. But there's a degree of choice about how obvious you are, in my case, about being pansexual. And therefore, why would you add that to the mix? But also these days, and I don't know if this resonates with you, there's increasing research about actually how much energy that masking and that hiding takes from you, and therefore how it impacts on your performance. And sort of thinking about, you're doing well, how much better would you be doing if your energy wasn't being diverted in that way?
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. I think my personal life often suffers when I'm doing well at work, often because I struggle to have the energy to interact with people, because I'm spending all my time trying to mask and get on with things, especially when I'm in person. But by the time I get home or at the weekend, I just feel like I don't have the energy to interact with people in the same way. I think a common term neurodiverse people use is having spoons. I feel like I don't have the spoons to do things. But again, since I became more open at my chambers about being neurodiverse, I think my performance is better because I'm not trying to hide it. And I'm able to have really frank conversations with my clerks around my diary management, and also the amount of webinars and seminars I'm expected to attend in order to kind of maximize the output and minimize the amount of emotional drainage. I think that's how I'd word it.
That's a very good expression. I may well adopt that one. Anyone else on the panel with any thoughts about being open or being masked and what difference it makes, or experience of how that's gone? Faisal?
Brie, I did want to speak on that, but also very briefly touch on the marketing issue, if I may. I'll deal with the marketing issue first while I remember it. I think it's important. I know lots of people who do not enjoy the whining and dining aspect of marketing. I'm not a big, I'm not a big fan of it either, Brie, and not just because it's very expensive. I think it's important to bear in mind that there are lots of ways of marketing. I'm not a big whining and dining person. What I tend to do in terms of marketing is I write a lot. I like doing seminars and different types of seminar. I also operate on the basis that when I meet new solicitors who I like, and part of my BD is I'll let them know, if you want to run something past someone, pick their brain, think about me. I'm very accessible. And I tend to find, I think some people think that marketing through whining and dining is the great key to unlock, to develop the practice you want. Having for a number of years convinced myself that was the way to go, and knowing lots of people that have tried it, I'm not convinced that is actually a particularly or necessarily particularly effective form of marketing. I think there are other ways, so please don't feel that you're putting yourself at a disadvantage if you don't do it. And I do very little of the whining and dining marketing because I don't like it, but I like to think that's not holding me back too much. Coming back to the point that was raised in terms of openness and women, I think the questioner was right. In my experience dealing with these sorts of issues at Bar Council and having attempted to help people who've raised these sorts of questions, I do think, well, put that aside for a moment. I think that women, by and large, get a raw deal generally. I think sexism is still pretty endemic in our profession, but it's pretty endemic in our society. So I don't think it's just women with autism. I think it's women full stop who get a raw deal. And if you're autistic, I think it's just the additional, is cherry on top the right word? Probably not. I think that there is an expectation that women will behave in a certain way. I can think of an example where in A Chambers, there was a chap there who was autistic and a woman who was autistic, but less noticeably so. The chap's behavior, neither I knew they were autistic, I don't think other people did. The chap's behavior was seen as, well, he's charmingly eccentric and he's just a bit odd. The woman's behavior was seen as, not my language, but what a weirdy. What I think helped in both cases, I'm a big fan of openness because fundamentally, in my experience, people aren't bad. People want to do the right thing. People want to be helpful if they know that actually what you need is help to meet your full potential. Nobody recruits, no chambers do you recruit on the basis, I'm going to recruit them so we can give them a good kicking for the next 10 years. We recruit on the basis we see potential there. We want you to prosper, and frankly, in most chambers, given most chambers get rent from people who, from their tenants, or all chambers will charge rent to their tenants. If you're prospering, we're prospering, and the more money you're making, the less rent I have to pay. So I'm a very happy camper if everyone is prospering. So I think openness, in the example I gave, autistic chap, woman is autistic, who was less open about her autism. I think that, well, both weren't particularly open about it, but once she was open about it, once she found she got a lot more support, her practice prospered because people wanted to be more supportive. But the other thing that she told me when I spoke to her about a year later was very much the point that I think you made, Chloe, which is she found it quite draining having to try and shoehorn her behavior into a way that didn't come naturally. Once she was open about it, she didn't feel she had to, if you like, wear the mask, and ceasing to wear the mask meant she wasn't quite as tired, didn't feel quite as compromised, and being much more herself meant that she was performing better, practice improved. So I'm a big fan of people being much more open.
Thank you, Faisal. Ollie, I think you wanted to come in with something.
Yes, thanks. And I think it really, Faisal's sort of taken a lot of the words out of my mouth, and I don't mean that in anything other than a good thing. As with so many diversity and inclusion issues, there's the intersection between these points is really important. And I think actually neurodiversity is one of the ones where it's most important, in my opinion, because of the way that women and men are socialized so differently from such a young age, it does interact very starkly with the way people learn to behave, especially if they're neurodivergent in some way. And because of the inherent privilege with being, or appearing to be, perhaps a man rather than appearing to be feminine, people's biases tend to be graded to an extent, I think. So where someone is faced with two people they might be biased against, and to use Faisal's example of two people who are both autistic, one who's also a man and one who's also a woman, those grades kick in to an extent, and the man becomes the friendly face of autism, whereas the woman is shunned away in a different light. So the way, and I really echo the point I'm getting to, is I really echo Faisal's point on openness, because most people aren't willfully bad on these issues. Most people are just incredibly ignorant about them. And when the most famous autistic depiction anyone can think of is Rain Man, they see a man with a specific set of traits that they don't see reflected in what they later find out to be as an autistic woman. And hopefully with more openness, it becomes more obvious and more apparent that people experience these things in hugely different ways, especially when they are socialized as girls rather than socialized as boys. So I strongly, and this is a continuous theme of neurodiversity in law, trying to encourage openness wherever possible, because we will get to the point where it's a point that's taken into account to give you any reasonable adjustments that are necessary, but it's not a point that's going to count against you. And the danger is these things will count against you because they're unspoken, either because someone is ignorant of them and doesn't understand them, or because someone is still biased against it because they haven't had that bias sort of mirrored and shown to them.
Thank you, Ollie. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to ask you all two questions. First of all, is there anything in particular that you think chambers or the Inns could do better to accommodate neurodivergent barristers?
I think a good thing to think about is promoting a atmosphere of acceptance and inclusivity rather than purely tolerance. I had a chat the other day with my own chambers about the way some of the wording is on the pupillage forms around extenuating circumstances and is there anything else you want to tell us? And also the adverts themselves. I think we've started to see adverts saying we encourage applicants from X background. I think it would be good to include we encourage applicants from neurodiverse backgrounds and to please tell us about this on your application form so we can make adjustments for you at interview, and to kind of positively state that there, because I know as someone who is neurodiverse and overthinks things, I would be there thinking, oh, they want me to declare it so they can weed me out and not interview me. But if we promote this environment of acceptance and recognizing that chambers profit from talented individuals can be neurodiverse. My general stereotype is they often are neurodiverse in some way if they're quite talented and distinct, and that's positive and that's business sense. And so their adverts should be worded in a way to encourage applicants not only to apply, but to apply and declare quite proudly that they have these conditions. And I think if we can improve that sense of declaring it as a positive thing, rather than feeling you must do it or you'll be penalised, then I think that could really improve the culture at both scholarship interview level and pupillage, and hopefully one day QC level for people.
Patrick, did you want to come in with anything in terms of what you would ask of chambers or the Inns?
Chloe has said it all. I completely agree. Nothing further to add. Well done, Chloe.
Either Ollie or Faisal want to come in with anything more?
I was going to suggest, Bree, I suppose talk about it more. I think there's a lot of ignorance, a lack of knowledge and awareness. And I found the instant you start having these discussions and people become aware of these issues, more is done to, frankly, help. And so greater dialogue, really.
And
Ollie?
just, thank you. Yeah, just to add, I mean, what's been said, openness, I completely agree with. Discussing it, putting on the website, hugely important, because as Chloe's touched on already, just being able to have that conversation is a huge first step. And from the perspective of a neurodivergent applicant for chambers, knowing that you're being seen and people want you to say something is a huge weight lifted. But something that's incredibly important as well is allyship. And I think that goes across the board in terms of equality and diversity issues. But in terms of neurodiversity in particular, at neurodiversity in law, we get the question a lot of like, oh, can I support you? Can I join if I'm not neurodivergent myself? Well, absolutely, yes. We don't distinguish people in that regard, because these changes come about because everyone, both people directly affected and the allies to those people, pull in the same direction. So expressing support and allyship, if you aren't yourself neurodivergent, is hugely valuable.
Well, can I endorse that, Ollie, as someone who joined as one of your champions when I learnt about you, and you put on amazing events. I've found a number of them fascinating and very educational, having people actually talk about different ways of thinking, different ways of learning. It actually informs yourself thinking about how you really think and learn, as well as learning about other people, so that you can be alert. I certainly think as a senior, in the way Faisal was talking about earlier, putting together teams to do things, actually, the more I understand different ways of thinking and being and learning, the more I can make sure those teams are as robust and inclusive and as effective as possible. So keep up the good work. Everyone who's listening, look at neurodiversity in law and think about going to some of their amazing events and supporting them, members, whether because you are neurodivergent or because you want to be an ally and know and understand better how to do that. And can I say a huge thank you to all of our panel. I hope this has been an informative, empowering, interesting talk for everyone. I've certainly enjoyed myself. Despite the fact I'm on holiday in Scotland, it was well worth breaking that to be here. And thank you, Patrick, Faisal, Ollie, and Chloe. You've been amazing.